As anybody who hasn't been living under a rock since 2008 undoubtedly knows, the superhero genre has been insanely popular with the public and has been supplying audiences with pretty much all of the big and most notable movies for over a decade since. But with that popularity and innovation has come a trend that I believe is only getting worse with each passing year and with each passing movie, particularly with Marvel. And that being the over-reliance on CGI. Now, at first, I don't think anybody would consider what they were doing to be unreasonable, but at this point, their movies might as well simply be entirely photorealistic CGI animated movies, because that's basically what they already are anyway. And today, I'm going to go over why I believe this to be a major problem. And minor spoilers may abound for anything in the MCU, so in case there's anything you aren't caught up on, you might just want to be on the lookout for that. Okay, so as I've already made quite clear in other videos, I am not the biggest fan of CGI on the whole. But that being said, I'm going to try and keep my opinions out of this video and instead try to objectively explain why this is a problem. And perhaps the best place to start is with laziness. I mean, if you look at behind the scenes footage of Marvel movies released starting around 2019, all you'll usually see is a couple of actors interacting with a few green props in front of a green screen. And even then, sometimes the actors aren't even wearing the costumes they're shown to in the movie. Seriously, have you ever seen what Tom Holland is actually wearing? They honestly just couldn't be bothered to make a stupid costume? I mean, they had to make those motion capture pajamas anyway, so wouldn't it have been easier and saved a lot of time and money if they just made something for him to physically wear instead of putting the poor animators through so much more work? Oh, and they don't want spoilers getting out? No problem, they'll just film actors separately and digitally insert them in later. And if an actor isn't available, no problem, we'll just use a double and head swap it. It's like they are ripping out anything and everything real or human about these movies simply to make things easier. It's all computers, and I guarantee you that there isn't a single shot in any Marvel movie made from Endgame onwards where everything in a single shot was real. Now listen, don't get me wrong. I do understand that there are certain things in these movies that can only be brought to life using CGI. And if they just used it for those necessary shots, then it wouldn't be a problem. But it's gotten to the point that they'll CGI anything, no matter how unnecessary it is, just because it's easier to do it that way. So not only does it make the whole thing feel more detached, but it ends up not looking very good either. Because frankly, even at Marvel's best, it isn't really all that impressive. Even Thanos, while looking more realistic than most CGI creatures, still has an air of computer generatedness to him, particularly when it comes to his integration and interaction with certain things around him. In other words, he may look good, but if you watch him long enough, it does start to become obvious that he was superimposed in after the fact. And if that's the best CGI Marvel has to offer, then what would the worst look like? Well, obvious green screens with clearly fake environments, costumes that look like they've just come out of a plastic factory, and just general superfluous effects that probably would have looked more real had physical props just been made for it. Because that's what a lot of people don't seem to understand here. CGI and computer effects don't equal realism. They can easily make the character look detached from their own backgrounds, their own clothes, and the people around them if it's overused, which is exactly what Marvel has been doing. I mean, at this point, every action movie, even non-Marvel ones, feel like nothing more than a contest to see who can have the most realistic CGI and special effects. And the thing was, that was impressive when people really had to blow up fake bridges and perform dangerous vehicle stunts, because genuine effort had to go into getting what they wanted to show on screen. Now it's all about who can use the most updated software that'll look completely fake in 10 years anyway. And listen, I'm not trying to take anything away from the hard work that goes into making these CGI effects, because I know it isn't easy on the people who actually have to work on them, and I do appreciate the time and effort that they put into making these things. But at the same time, it isn't fair to them either that Marvel puts so much extra work on their shoulders because they're too lazy to actually build or buy something to physically put into a shot that they easily could. I mean, imagine if somebody stormed into the head offices at Marvel and said to them, "I dare you to make a movie without any CGI." Now, as I said before, I know that's an unrealistic dare, but the point is that they would probably look at that person like bats had just flown out of their ears. The idea of not using CGI for everything is so alien to them that at this point they would never consider not using it for even the smallest of tasks. Frankly, they're taking the whole thing and the people that make these effects for granted, and the audience is only making it worse by constantly praising these effects and begging for more. Because that's another thing that troubles me sometimes. If you go all the way back to the 1930s, the highest grossing movie of that decade, and still the highest grossing movie of all time when adjusted for inflation, was an epic period piece telling the trials and tribulations of people during the Civil War. Or even in the 1960s, the two highest grossing movies was the war epic Spartacus, and behind that was Alfred Hitchcock's landmark horror movie Psycho. Fast forward to the 2010s, and the highest grossing movies aren't ones that are praised for their stories, but the ones that have the best CGI effects. It seems to moviegoers that nothing is more important than the CGI anymore, and I just have to say, I find something about that very sad. A movie should be way more than what it can offer in terms of CGI effects, and yet that's all anybody seems to want anymore. And if that is indeed what they crave, then Marvel has certainly been pleasing them all right. But for one last thing I'd like to leave you off with, consider this. Look at this footage from Captain America: The First Avenger, which takes place during World War II. Now contrast that with this. You notice how in Captain America's case, there's nothing really remarkable about it and looks just like every other action movie from that decade? I might even go as far as to say that it looks nearly identical to the war scenes in Wonder Woman, and that's supposed to take place in an entirely different war. It all looks the same. But this footage from the movie Where Eagles Dare looks as though it could have been ripped straight from documentary footage from the war, despite being filmed 23 years after World War II ended. And the same can be said for Raiders of the Lost Ark. You could easily believe that this is taking place during World War II, not just because of the uniforms, but because it has the look and feel of the era. But at the same time, it still has a style all its own from Where Eagles Dare, despite achieving that same effect. Now, what's the reason for this? Well, two things, really. The first being the CGI. No surprises there. Because the thing about CGI is, it always has the same starting point no matter what. And because of that, a lot of effort has to go into making things look different, such as cars, war-torn areas, and even explosions, to make them look different from each other. So to save time and costs, they'll usually use the same basic models not only in multiple scenes, but in multiple movies across studios. And even when it isn't the same companies, the movie studios are usually just fine with generic looking stuff. Because again, it saves a lot of money that way, which makes everything look the same. But because everything had to be built in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, that leads everything to have its own look and aesthetic. In both these movies, most of the filming was done on actual locations, which makes them look much more authentic than having the actors just walk in front of a green screen. And props were actually built by real people, giving interesting glimpses into the kind of weapons, uniforms, and vehicles they may have actually used in the war, among other things. My point is, CGI encourages repetition and causes everything to blend into each other. When Hollywood didn't have that, every movie tended to stand out from each other more, because the design relied a lot more on the creator's interpretation of what they were trying to depict. And the second reason is the film itself. Now I know this might sound odd, but part of the reason Where Eagles Dare looks so much like the real thing is because it was filmed using the same cameras and film that documentaries and movies of the 1940s were filmed with. So as a result, the movie has the same feeling many associate with that period in history. And the same goes for Raiders of the Lost Ark, as it was also filmed with the same equipment. Captain America, and pretty much all other modern movies, however, are filmed with digital cameras. And even when they still use film, most of the time the final product is still run through a computer so that any and all CGI effects can be added in later. And as a result, the computer sterilizes the film. It makes it look too perfect, too clear. It removes that level of slight imperfection about the real world that regular film naturally had and could catch. And just to give another example of that, you notice how Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, for the most part, actually feels like the 1960s? That it does a better job than most modern movies of capturing the feel of another era? Well, one reason for that is because Tarantino shot the movie on actual film and avoided CGI at all costs. Really, one of the only scenes to use CGI was inserting Leonardo DiCaprio into The Great Escape. Pretty much everything else in the movie was done practically or with conventional movie tricks. And as a result, it feels much closer to a movie that could have actually been shot in the 60s. You notice the shots of the Wrecking Crew don't look that far off from the shots made 50 years later in the theater? That's because of the film it was shot on. Now please do note here that I'm not saying that just because a movie is shot on digital, that automatically means it'll have this sterilized effect. The less CGI shots there are, the less likely for it to have that effect. But considering that Marvel uses CGI in pretty much every frame of their movies, with only the most state-of-the-art digital cameras, and that should pretty much tell you everything you need to know about why they look the way they do. Okay, so to put it simply, Marvel's dependency on CGI honestly makes their movies look rather visually unappealing most of the time, puts their animators to a lot of extra work for nothing, and is really only used to make things easier for the people on set. And again, I'd like to believe that people are sick of so many digital effects in every single movie they go to see, But considering the way both Avatar and its sequel were absolute box office juggernauts, with their main selling points being their extremely innovative CGI, I really have to wonder if that is actually the case. Maybe CGI is all people really care about anymore, and Marvel is just jumping on the bandwagon. But either way, I can pretty much guarantee you that 40 or 50 years down the line, Marvel will be looked at as extremely dated and visually unappealing, while movies made back in the 1950s that had to rely on old school effects and didn't cut corners will still be praised as holding up even 100 years after they were made. Okay, that's pretty much all I had to say on that. So now I want to hear your opinions. Do you believe that Marvel relies way too much on CGI, or do you believe that they should use even more of it in their movies? Please feel free to discuss your thoughts in the comments. And please do note that I am not a filming expert here. If I was given a camera and told to shoot a movie, I'm sure it would be one of the worst things ever made. So please do forgive me if I made one or two mistakes when I was explaining how the film and cameras work, as I really have only a passing knowledge of the subject. And thank you all for watching. It is greatly appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.